Dorothy's bedraggled state. "This is no place for beggars, go beg for change somewhere else," he bellowed, completely ignoring James's dire condition. James chose that moment to have another violent spasm, nearly bringing them both crashing to the floor. His face had now taken on an alarming purple hue. Dorothy struggled to keep him upright, her legs trembling with the effort. "Can't you see he's dying? It's an emergency, he was poisoned," Dorothy yelled, her voice echoing through the chaotic lobby. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with deep dark circles under her eyes, didn't even lift her eyes from her computer screen. "Take a number and wait, all the doctors are busy with a multiple emergency from a highway accident," she said. "Can't you see he's dying? This is an emergency, he was poisoned," Dorothy insisted, desperate. A second security guard approached, increasing the tension in the air. James began having more violent seizures, his heavy body slipping from Dorothy's frail arms. The girl tried desperately to keep him upright, her legs trembling under the weight. "He's bleeding. Oh my God, he's bleeding." Panic was evident in the girl's voice as she tried to wipe the blood with her tattered sleeve. At that moment, an older nurse emerged from one of the corridors, carrying a stack of medical records. Her experienced eyes took in the scene, lingering first on James and then on Dorothy. Her expression changed instantly. "Blessed Virgin, this is James Cater, the businessman," she exclaimed, dropping the medical records to the floor with a thud. The older nurse's eyes widened in recognition of James, her medical records forgotten on the floor. "My God, it's James Cater. Call the doctor immediately," she shouted, running to examine the patient but keeping a suspicious look towards Dorothy. "Don't let that girl leave, she must have something to do with his condition," she ordered the security guards, who tightened their grip on the child's arms even more. James began having an even more violent seizure, his entire body shaking against the hospital's cold floor. The nurse shouted orders as other staff rushed in with equipment. Dorothy tried to explain, but her voice was drowned out by the commotion. "He was poisoned. I tried to help him, he got a little better, but he's getting worse again," Dorothy explained, but most of the staff ignored her completely. A heart monitor was rushed in, and the sound of James's irregular heartbeats filled the air. Dorothy watched helplessly as the nurses worked, connecting electrodes and checking his vital signs. No one even looked in her direction. "The heartbeats are getting weaker. Where's the doctor?" one of the nurses shouted, her hands moving quickly over James's body. The businessman began exhibiting more alarming symptoms, his skin took on a bluish hue, and his breathing became shallower by the minute. The security guards kept holding Dorothy, who struggled desperately. "He's going to die if you don't act fast. The poison was dark, I saw her put it in," her words were lost in the chaos of the emergency room. Finally, the doctor arrived, running down the hallway. Upon seeing James, he immediately began shouting orders. "Emergency room 3 now. This case looks like poisoning, call the police, we need to know what happened to him," the doctor said, assessing the patient. "The police have already been called, doctor. This girl was with him, she probably has something to do with it," one of the security guards replied. Dorothy felt her heart sink when she heard sirens approaching. She knew no one would believe her story, that her word was worthless. She was a beggar, they would never believe Sonia James could be capable of such wickedness against her husband, especially with the power she had. James was being rushed down the hallway, and Dorothy could do nothing. "If he dies, it's your fault for not listening to me," she shouted, tears of anger and frustration streaming down her dirty face. The sound of the machines grew more frantic, and Dorothy could hear the doctor's alarmed voices as they took James away. Another violent seizure shook his body on the gurney, and the doctors ran alongside him. Blood pressure plummeting. "We need immediate treatment," the doctor's voice echoed down the hallway. The doors of the emergency room opened again, and several police officers entered. Dorothy panicked, feeling her heart racing in her chest. One of the officers immediately pointed at her. "This beggar brought a poisoned millionaire to the emergency room, she probably did something to him," the security guard said, then turned to Dorothy. Now you won't escape, you little brat, he finished, tightening his grip on her arm even more. James's body disappeared behind the emergency room doors, leaving Dorothy alone in the lobby, surrounded by accusing looks. The sound of medical equipment was replaced by the jingling of handcuffs. Why does no one ever believe a street child? She thought bitterly as the officers approached. The sound of the hospital's automatic doors opening and 3 police officers entering the emergency room, their heavy boots echoed across the ceramic floor, and their impeccable uniforms contrasted with the chaotic hospital environment. The oldest officer, with graying hair and a stern expression, immediately located Dorothy. We received a report that a citizen was poisoned. His name is Mr. James, a local businessman. They said he was brought in by a beggar. Was it you? The officer asked, and immediately one of the hospital security guards pointed at Dorothy, who was still looking at the emergency room doors, worried about James. The officers approached like predators surrounding their prey. Dorothy felt her heart race but remained steadfast, even when the tallest officer grabbed her arm with unnecessary force. The smell of sweat and fear mingled with the hospital's antiseptic scent. You have a lot of explaining to do, girl. What did you do to Mr. James? Asked the older officer, his stale coffee breath making Dorothy instinctively recoil. The officers dragged Dorothy down the hospital corridor, ignoring her protests. Other patients and staff watched the scene with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. The girl tried to break free, but the grip on her arm was too strong. I didn't do anything. I'm trying to save his life. It was his wife, Sonia. I saw her put the poison in his food at the Sterling restaurant, Dorothy shouted, her voice echoing off the white walls. Dorothy was taken to a small room in the hospital. The officers shoved her into a hard plastic chair while the older officer pulled up another chair to sit across from her, his hard eyes studying every move the girl made. Let's start from the beginning. Why were you at the Sterling restaurant? That's no place for people like you, he said, emphasizing the last words with disdain. Dorothy took a deep breath, trying to control the tremor in her voice. She recounted again how she had been looking for food behind the restaurant, about seeing Sonia through the kitchen window, about the dark liquid being poured onto the plate. The younger officer took notes, occasionally exchanging skeptical glances with his colleagues. So you want us to believe that Mrs. Sonia James, known for her philanthropic work, tried to poison her own husband, and only you, a beggar, saw it happen? The sergeant questioned, his voice laden with disbelief. The interrogation continued for several minutes, the same questions being asked repeatedly in different forms, trying to find contradictions in her story. Dorothy kept her account consistent but could feel that each word was met with more disbelief. Why would you care about saving his life? What do you gain from it? The younger officer asked, his tone suggesting hidden motives. It was at this moment that the sound of high heels began to echo down the corridor, approaching rapidly. Dorothy felt her blood run cold as Sonia James entered the small room like an actress taking the stage, her eyes reddened from carefully manipulated tears. I was informed by the hospital that my husband was brought to the emergency room. What did this criminal do to him? Sonia asked, her voice choked with emotion that Dorothy knew to be false. Sonia moved around the room like a snake about to strike, her high heels marking each step with calculated precision. Her red dress, the same one from the restaurant, now seemed even more menacing in Dorothy's eyes. The woman approached the officers, her perfectly manicured hands trembling in a studied display of distress. My poor, Sonia began, her voice dripping with anguish. I had an issue to take care of while we were eating at the restaurant and had to leave earlier, letting him finish his meal. I didn't think they would let people like this beggar get near the restaurant. They always want more than just food, Sonia said, casting a venomous glare at Dorothy. Sergeant Ramirez offered his chair to Sonia, who sat down with rehearsed Sonia, her eyes previously feigning tears now gleaming with a malice that only Dorothy seemed to perceive. The girl felt her stomach churn as the woman began to speak again. I saw this girl lurking around the restaurant several times today. I had to take a call in the middle of the meal. That's when I saw her. James has always been so kind. She must have put something in his food when no one was looking to try and rob him, Sonia declared, her voice trembling just the right amount. Dorothy tried to stand up, indignant at the lies, but the younger officer shoved her back into the chair with force. The bitter taste of injustice filled her mouth as Sonia continued her performance. She's lying. I saw her putting the poison. It was a dark liquid she took out of her purse, Dorothy shouted, her voice hoarse with desperation. Sonia brought her hands to her face in an Oscar-worthy performance. See how she lies. She's probably part of some gang. They must have planned to kidnap my James, she sobbed, making the officers exchange meaningful glances. Please, ask the waiters at the restaurant. They must have seen when she entered the kitchen, Dorothy pleaded, feeling hot tears stream down her dirty face. The sergeant gestured to the younger officer, who immediately took position behind Dorothy's chair. The metallic sound of the handcuffs being prepared made the girl's heart race. We have a respectable witness against the word of a street urchin, declared the sergeant, his voice laden with prejudice. The sergeant leaned forward, his face inches from Dorothy's, the smell of stale coffee on his breath making the girl want to recoil, but she stood firm, holding the officer's gaze. How does a street urchin know Mrs. James's name? How did you know that was James Cater? He questioned, his voice heavy with suspicion. Dorothy tried to explain about the magazine she found on the streets that she used some to cover herself, about how everyone knew the James, but the younger officer interrupted her. How convenient, isn't it, knowing precisely one of the richest men in the city, he said, exchanging meaningful glances with the sergeant. The third officer, who had been silent until then, approached with a tablet. Look what I found, 3 cases of thefts at luxury restaurants in the last month. In all of them a street girl was seen lurking around before, he declared, showing the news on the screen. It wasn't me. I've never stolen anything in my life, I just look for food they throw away, Dorothy protested, feeling tears begin to form. Sonia brought her hands to her chest in a theatrical gesture. Just last week, I lost an extremely expensive bracelet at another restaurant. Who knows, she insinuated, making the officers exchange glances again. Can't you see she's lying? Why would I save her husband if I wanted to rob them? Dorothy argued desperately. The sergeant took out his notepad. Maybe that's the question. You weren't trying to save him, you barged into the restaurant screaming about poison, caused panic, seems like a perfect distraction for something bigger, he theorized, his voice laden with certainty. Exactly. Sonia exclaimed, a single perfectly timed tear running down her face. She must be part of some gang. Using children is so common in these cases. Dorothy looked from one face to another, searching for any sign of doubt, any crack of empathy, but she found only hard, accusing expressions. Sonia had succeeded. Her word as a wealthy, respectable adult had completely destroyed any chance of Dorothy being heard. I hope you make this criminal pay for what she did, Sonia said, walking towards the door with the elegance of someone who had just won a battle. The truth will come out. He'll get better and tell you it was you. Don't you see that while you waste time accusing me, she might try to hurt him again? Dorothy tried one last time, her voice almost a whisper. Sonia stood up, smoothing her dress with a discreet smile on her red lips. I need to see my husband now, Dorothy shouted, struggling when she felt the officer's hands on her wrists. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Dorothy's delicate skin, the click of the lock sounding like a final sentence. The younger officer yanked her up from the chair while she was still trying to make herself heard. Please, someone has to believe me, she's going to try to hurt him again, her voice broke into sobs. The sound of the handcuffs seemed to echo through the hospital corridors as Dorothy was led away from the small room, handcuffed. Sonia, near the door, her cruel smile hidden behind a silk handkerchief she used to dab at non-existent tears. Other patients and hospital staff stopped to watch the scene. I hope you learn to keep these people away from decent establishments, Sonia said, loudly. Enough for everyone to hear, prompting murmurs of approval from those present. The officer shoved Dorothy down the hallway, her small legs barely able to keep up with his long strides. Through her tears, she could still see the emergency room doors where James was fighting for his life. The sound of the medical machines reached her, muffled. "You won't be able to hurt him again. When he wakes up, he'll tell the truth," Dorothy shouted to Sonia, who was already making her way to the emergency wing with her elegant gait. A commotion at the emergency room doors caught everyone's attention. The medical team was rushing back and forth, and the machines started beeping more intensely. Dorothy felt her heart sink as she heard the doctor's shouts for more medication. "No. I need to stay, he might be getting worse. Please," the girl begged, trying to break free, but the handcuffs only hurt her wrists more. Sonia seized the moment for her final performance. She ran towards the emergency room, her high heels echoing dramatically down the hallway. "Save my husband. Don't let this criminal take another innocent life," she cried out, eliciting gasps of compassion from those present. "The only criminal here is you, murderer, liar," Dorothy shouted, now being dragged away by 2 officers. The hospital doors loomed closer, and with them, the terrible reality that Dorothy had failed in her mission. Not only had she not managed to completely save James, but now it would be impossible to protect him from Sonia's second attempt. "If he dies, the blame will be on all of you who wouldn't listen. His blood will be on your hands," her words echoed through the lobby as she was taken away. The cold night air hit her face as the automatic doors opened, the police car lights still flashing, casting dancing shadows on the hospital walls. Dorothy cast one last look back, only to see Sonia disappear through the emergency room doors. "You won't win, Sonia, the truth always comes out, no matter how long it takes," the girl shouted one last time before being shoved into the police car. The sound of the vehicle door closing was like a period at the end of her freedom. Through the fogged-up glass, Dorothy watched the hospital where she left not only James but also her only chance for justice. The sirens began to wail, and the car started moving. Why does the world prefer to believe beautiful lies rather than difficult truths? She thought bitterly as silent tears streamed down her dirty face. In the hospital's emergency room, doctors and nurses scurried back and forth, desperately trying to save James's life. The machines surrounding the bed made loud, frightening noises with lights constantly flashing, showing that something was very, very wrong with him. James, still wearing his nice suit, now drenched in sweat, trembled and twitched as if fighting against something invisible inside him. "His blood pressure is dropping too fast," shouted one of the nurses, looking scared at the machines. "The usual medications aren't working at all." The doctor, the hospital's oldest and most experienced physician, took charge of the situation. He had seen many similar cases over the years and knew he had to act quickly if he wanted to save James's life. "Everyone, let's try something different," he said in a firm, calm voice amidst all the chaos. "Prepare the broad-spectrum antidote immediately." The team sprang into action, fetching medications, equipment, and everything else that might be needed. The air in the room felt heavy, but they were relentless, knowing each second was crucial. "We're losing him," shouted one of the younger doctors, his voice trembling with fear, but the lead doctor remained focused, unwavering. With utmost care, he administered the antidote to James and began other emergency procedures. "Come on, Mr. James," he muttered softly, looking at his pale face, "fight with all your might. You're a strong man, I know you can do it." The minutes dragged by, feeling like hours, as the medical team continued their efforts, watching for any sign of improvement. Gradually, the medications began to take effect, James's blood pressure stabilized, and his breathing became steadier. The alarms quieted as the machines indicated he was responding. "Look, his vitals are improving," said a nurse with a relieved smile. "His heart rate is stabilizing." The lead doctor let out a long, relieved sigh. "Everyone, you did an amazing job. James is not out of danger yet, but we're on the right track. Let's keep monitoring him closely." Hours passed with the team taking turns watching over James, measuring his blood pressure, checking his heart, and making sure the antidote continued working. Finally, after intense rounds of care, The doctor decided it was safe to move James to a private room where he could rest and recover. "There you go, Mr. James," said the nurse, fluffing the pillows to make him comfortable. "Now you can rest, but don't worry, we're nearby taking care of you." James remained unconscious, his breathing soft and steady, the machines around him making a constant, reassuring hum. The doctors and nurses continued to observe him, relieved by his progress, whispering among themselves about how close they'd come to losing him. As the hospital quieted down for the night, a shadow slipped into James's room, a figure dressed in a long black coat with a cold, calculating look. It was Sonia, watching him with a twisted smile as he lay unaware and vulnerable. "Well, well, dear," she whispered, running a gloved finger along his pale face, "you're more resilient than I imagined." She held up a small vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid, the same one she'd used at the restaurant. "Perhaps you need an extra dose to help you finally rest." She leaned closer, carefully uncorking the vial, the acrid smell filling the room. But just as she prepared to administer the poison, she heard footsteps in the hall. Quickly, she slipped the vial back into her pocket, turning just as the doctor entered the room. With flawless composure, Sonia assumed a look of concern. "Oh, doctor," she exclaimed, feigning relief, "I was so worried about my husband. Is he going to be all right?" The doctor observed her with a skeptical eye but returned his attention to James. "We're doing everything possible, Your husband is stable, but he needs rest and continuous care." "Of course," Sonia nodded, carefully masking her irritation, "I understand. I'll do whatever I can to help with his recovery." "Good," said the doctor, still watching her, a subtle hint of distrust in his gaze. "If you'll excuse me, I need to check his vitals now. You can wait outside, I'll update you shortly." With a forced smile, Sonia left the room, pausing only to cast one last venomous look at James. She was thwarted for the moment but wasn't giving up. Leaving the hospital, she planned her next move, still determined to secure the fortune she believed was rightfully hers. Meanwhile, James remained in a peaceful sleep, oblivious to the danger hovering around him, dreaming of better days. The strength within him, the will to live, would prove stronger than any poison or ill intent, but for now, he rested, unaware of the shadow lingering just beyond the hospital walls. In a dark holding cell across town, Dorothy sat quietly, her knees drawn to her chest, staring at the cold grey floor. The detective's harsh words still rang in her mind: "If James dies, you'll be charged with murder." It was an early conviction for a girl who'd only wanted to help, a punishment for doing the right thing. She swallowed hard, trying to contain the tears that threatened to fall, feeling the weight of helplessness and hopelessness pressing down on her. "They've already decided I'm guilty, even without proof," she thought bitterly, her heart aching with loneliness and despair. The sound of the detective's fingers tapping on the metal table broke the silence. He looked at her with the weariness and disdain of someone who'd already made up his mind. "Your story doesn't make sense, you know that, right?" he asked. A street girl with no proof accusing a woman like Sonia James of poisoning her own husband. Dorothy met his gaze, red-eyed from holding back tears. She knew exactly who she was up against. Sonia was powerful, influential, and held the world in her grasp, but that didn't change the truth. "I saw what I saw. I'm not lying," Dorothy said, her voice soft but unwavering. The detective scoffed, rising from his chair to pace the room. "You think anyone will believe you, girl? Sonia has lawyers, power, influence, and you have nothing, just your word against hers." Dorothy clenched her fists, feeling the truth and her helplessness battle within her. She had nothing but the truth, and she knew that one day, somehow, it would come to light. "I have nothing, but I have the truth," she whispered, and no matter how hard she tries to hide it, the truth always comes out. The detective stopped walking, a look of exasperation on his face. "You really think a street girl like you can beat someone like Sonia James?" He laughed dryly. "This world isn't a fairy tale, girl. In the real world, power wins." But despite his words, Dorothy's resolve didn't waver. If she gave up now, Sonia would win, and James would die without the truth ever being known. I tried. If he dies, it won't be my fault, Dorothy said, holding her chained wrists up for him to see. It will be because you didn't want to listen. You chose to believe the lies of a rich woman. The detective rolled his eyes, signaling the officers outside to return her to her cell. We'll see, girl. Without proof, you stay here. As Dorothy was led back to her cold, empty cell, she felt despair weighing her down, but even with the odds against her, she refused to give up. James's life depended on the truth coming out, and no matter how bleak it seemed, she would fight for it. Alone in her cell, with only the faint morning light filtering through a tiny window, she waited. She could only hope that James would wake up and remember the truth. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Dorothy looked up, her heart pounding, as the door opened. The same detective entered, his face unreadable. James Cater woke up, he said, his voice low and grave. Dorothy felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. He survived. Her voice was barely above a whisper. The detective gave a slight nod. Yes, but he hasn't said anything yet. He's weak, and his condition is still critical, but he's alive. A wave of relief washed over Dorothy. James was alive, despite everything. He had survived. We'll see what he has to say, the detective continued. Until then, you're still locked up here. Don't think this changes things, not until we know the truth. Dorothy nodded, her heart pounding. He'll tell the truth. He has to. Her voice was filled with a quiet, desperate determination. The detective walked away, and the cell door closed again, but this time, Dorothy felt something different, a glimmer of hope. James was alive, and as long as he was, there was a chance for her to be believed. Days passed slowly, each hour blending into the next. Finally, one morning, James began to stir, as if emerging from a dense, confusing dream. The hospital room was silent except for the steady hum of machines around him. His body felt heavy, and every muscle ached as though he'd been carrying an invisible weight for too long. Blinking to adjust to the light filtering through the window, he tried to make sense of where he was. His memories were blurry, fragmented. He remembered the restaurant, the food, then the pain, and then Dorothy. The image of the street girl flashed through his mind. I'm alive, he whispered to himself, his voice hoarse and weak. The door opened, and two doctors entered, accompanied by a nurse. They looked cautious, professional, but James could sense a certain hesitance in their expressions. Mr. James, one of the doctors began gently, you were in critical condition. You were poisoned, but we managed to stabilize you in time. Your recovery will be long, but you're out of immediate danger. Poison? James repeated, his mind reeling. How? Who? He struggled to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced him back down. Don't overexert yourself, warned the doctor, adjusting the devices by his bed. The poison caused severe damage, but fortunately, your response to the treatment was positive. As James processed the information, fragments of memory began to resurface. He recalled the pain, the panic, and the girl who tried to save him. There was a girl, he murmured, his voice faint. She tried to help me. Where is she? The doctors exchanged glances before responding cautiously. There's no record of any girl visiting you, Mr. James. The only visitor listed is your wife. No, there was a girl, James insisted, his voice growing stronger with urgency. She shouted something. She knew something was wrong. The doctors tried to reassure him, attributing it to confusion and fatigue, but James was certain. He struggled to make sense of it, feeling as though he was missing a vital piece of the puzzle. Find her, he pleaded. She tried to save me. After the doctors left, James lay in silence, frustration simmering beneath the surface. He knew the girl was real, he could still hear her voice, still see her terrified expression as she warned him. She had risked everything for him. The nights that followed were restless. Each time he closed his eyes, he would see fragments of the evening play out in his mind. He could still taste the bitterness of the poison, still feel the chill of terror, but Dorothy's image was the clearest of all, a girl who had saved him against impossible odds. On the morning of his discharge, James convinced the doctors he was well enough to leave. Though his body was still weak, his mind was made up. He needed to find the girl who had saved his life. Stepping outside, he felt the weight of responsibility settle upon him. Dorothy was out there somewhere, possibly in trouble, and he owed her more than he could ever repay. He got into his car, his heart pounding with urgency, and knew exactly where to go, the Sterling. Traffic seemed to move at an agonizingly slow pace. Every second felt like an hour as James made his way back to the restaurant, hoping against hope that his instincts were correct. Finally, he arrived, parking hastily and heading toward the back alley. The restaurant was just beginning to open, and the scent of food wafted from the kitchen. James's pulse quickened as he approached the area where Dorothy had last been seen, and then he heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable, a voice pleading, "Please, just a bit of food, I'm so hungry." He turned the corner, and there she was, digging through the trash, her small figure almost disappearing among the bins. She looked thinner, her face weary, but it was unmistakably her. "Dorothy," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, her eyes widening in disbelief. For a moment, she seemed ready to flee, but then recognition dawned, and she froze. "Mr. James, you're alive," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes," he replied, stepping closer, "thanks to you. You saved my life, Dorothy." The words seemed to reach her, and a flicker of relief crossed her face, quickly replaced by a shadow of fear. "But they arrested me. They said I tried to hurt you." "I didn't, I only wanted to help," she said, her voice breaking. "I know," James said gently, reaching out a hand. "I remember everything, and I'm here to make things right." Dorothy stared at him, hope beginning to replace the fear in her eyes. James knew then that he had found her, not just physically but in spirit. Here was a girl who had risked everything for him despite the danger and the odds. "I won't let them hurt you, Dorothy," he promised, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "You're coming with me. You're safe now." And as they left the alley, a new journey began, one of healing, redemption, and a chance at a life neither of them could have imagined. Together, they would face the truth, and together, they would rebuild from the ashes. Days passed, and true to his promise, James began to fulfill his commitment to Dorothy. He brought her to his home, a place she'd only ever dreamed of, a mansion far removed from the streets that had been her entire world. Though she was initially hesitant, overwhelmed by the size and grandeur of the estate, James's gentle guidance helped her find a sense of belonging she had never known before. With time, Dorothy settled in, her days no longer filled with fear and hunger but with new opportunities. James, too, found himself changed by her presence. For the first time in years, his home felt warm, filled with laughter and free of the tension that had existed during his marriage to Sonia. He became a father figure to Dorothy, guiding her and nurturing her potential, grateful every day for the chance she'd given him to see life through new eyes. Days passed, and true to his promise, James began to fulfill his commitment to Dorothy. He brought her to his home, a place she'd only ever dreamed of, a mansion far removed from the streets that had been her entire world. Though she was initially hesitant, overwhelmed by the size and grandeur of the estate, James's gentle guidance helped her find a sense of belonging she had never known before. With time, Dorothy settled in, her days no longer filled with fear and hunger but with new opportunities. James, too, found himself changed by her presence. For the first time in years, his home felt warm, filled with laughter and free of the tension that had existed during his marriage to Sonia. He became a father figure to Dorothy, guiding her and nurturing her potential, grateful every day for the chance she'd given him to see life through new eyes. As weeks turned into months, the bond between them grew. James arranged for Dorothy to receive tutoring, opening doors to education she'd never dreamed of, and he encouraged her to explore her interests. For Dorothy, this world of books, art, and learning was as foreign as it was exhilarating. She threw herself into her studies with determination, driven by a desire to make the most of the opportunity James had given her. One evening, after they had finished dinner, Dorothy hesitantly approached James in his study. "Mr. James," she began, then paused, nervous. James looked up from his book, smiling. "You can call me Dad, you know." She blushed, then nodded. "I wanted to ask, do you think the truth will ever come out about Mrs. Sonia?" James's face grew serious, the mention of his estranged wife casting a shadow. "The police are still investigating, but it's difficult. Sonia is clever, and with her connections, proving her involvement hasn't been easy." Dorothy looked down, disappointed. I don't want her to hurt anyone else." James reached over, gently lifting her chin so she met his gaze. "I promise you, Dorothy, she won't. We'll make sure she doesn't hurt anyone else, and even if justice is slow, I have faith that one way or another, the truth will come out." True to his word, James continued pressing the police to dig deeper into Sonia's activities. Gradually, evidence surfaced: hidden bank accounts, suspicious transactions, and testimonies from people who had witnessed her mistreatment of others. Piece by piece, Sonia's carefully constructed facade began to crumble, revealing a web of manipulation and deceit that had allowed her to evade accountability for years. Finally, the day came when Sonia was brought to trial. Dorothy and James attended, and as they sat in the courtroom, they watched the woman who had once held James's life in her hands stand before a judge. For Dorothy, seeing Sonia stripped of her power and influence felt surreal. She was no longer the intimidating figure Dorothy had feared, but a woman facing the consequences of her actions. As the trial proceeded, Sonia's web of lies unraveled. Witnesses came forward, recounting her manipulation and cruelty. The prosecution presented evidence of her attempts to poison James, her plan to alter his will, and her attempts to frame Dorothy. Piece by piece, the truth came to light. In the end, Sonia was found guilty of multiple charges, including attempted murder. She was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and though her influence had once seemed unassailable, she left the courtroom disoriented and powerless. For Dorothy and James, justice brought a sense of closure. The weight of the past lifted, and they were free to move forward without the shadow of Sonia looming over them. Their journey from fear and betrayal to redemption and healing was complete. From that day forward, James and Dorothy dedicated themselves to helping others who had suffered in silence, just as Dorothy once had. Together, they turned their story into a mission, creating a foundation to support children without families and offering a safe haven for those who, like Dorothy, had been overlooked by society. And so, what had begun as a tale of survival and resilience became one of hope, family, and the transformative power of kindness. Dorothy's life, once defined by hardship, now held promise, and with James by her side, she faced the future with courage and joy. Their bond, born out of adversity, would remain unbreakable, a reminder that even in the darkest times, light and love could be found. Did you enjoy this story? If yes, drop a like and a nice comment to encourage us. Don't forget that we love you,